Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics.
Yes.
Where we explore timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today.
That's right.
And we are diving deeper into Stephen Charnock's uh, The Existence and Attributes of God.
Yes.
And, as we journey through this book, it's like we're uncovering layer after layer of God's awesomeness.
Absolutely.
Today we're focusing on Chapter 8, Knowledge of God, specifically Part 3.
Yeah, and in this section, Charnock really tackles a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries. How can a God who is outside of time truly know what's happening within time?
Right?
How can he know the future without it somehow already being set in stone? It's a tough one, right?
It is. I mean, my brain starts to hurt when I think about it too long.
Yeah,
But Charnock, he's got some really interesting thoughts on this.
he does.
Specifically this idea that God knows by his own essence.
Right, and that might sound a little abstract at first, but it's actually a key to understanding how Charnock tackles this whole time conundrum. He's saying that God doesn't need to observe or learn about creation like we do, because creation is actually a reflection of what's already in God's knowledge. Imagine that, like, this is God's essence is like a perfect blueprint that contains all the possibilities, all the choices, all the outcomes.
So it's not that God is up in heaven with a giant telescope peering down and watching everything unfold.
Exactly. It's more like God's knowledge is the source from which everything flows.
Yeah.
It's the foundation on which all of creation is built. And because God's essence is unchanging, his knowledge is also unchanging.
That makes sense. But it also raises another question for me.
Okay.
If God already knows everything that's going to happen, does that mean we don't have free will? I mean, is everything predetermined?
Ugh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, even Charnock wrestled with that one. He doesn't give us a simple answer, but he does make it clear that God's knowledge doesn't negate our choices. It's more like God sees all the possibilities, all the paths we could take, but he allows us to make those choices freely.
So it's like God sees the whole maze from above, but we're down in the maze making our way through it.
That's a great analogy. We're experiencing time linearly, making decisions one after another, but God sees the entire maze at once, all the twists and turns, all the dead ends and the successful paths.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But tell me, how does this all connect to this idea that God knows by one act of intuition, another one of those mind-bending Charnock phrases?
Well, think of it this way. You and I, we learn things gradually. We read a book one page at a time. We learn a skill through practice and repetition. But Charnock is saying God's knowledge isn't like that. It's immediate. It's complete. It's instantaneous. He uses this amazing image. Imagine someone reading an entire library in a single moment. That's closer to how God knows.
Wow, that really stretches my imagination. So there's no processing, no learning curve for God.
Not in the way we understand it. God's knowledge is perfect and complete from all eternity. It's part of who he is.
This is incredible. It really challenges the way I usually think about knowledge and understanding.
And this leads to another crucial point that Charnock emphasizes. God knows all things independently.
Okay.
It's not like he needs us to tell him what's going on or what we're thinking. His knowledge doesn't rely on anything outside of himself. He's not learning or being informed by anything. It's like the sun emitting light. The sun isn't illuminated by the things it shines on, right?
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So God's knowledge is self-sufficient.
Yes.
It comes from within himself.
Exactly. And it further emphasizes that God doesn't need us to tell him what we're thinking or feeling. He already knows.
That's both comforting and a little bit terrifying, isn't it? Knowing that there's nothing we can hide from God.
It is. But think of it this way. Wouldn't you rather have a God who knows you completely, flaws and all, than a God who is distant and uninvolved in your life?
You're right. It's actually pretty amazing to think that we're known so intimately by the creator of the universe.
It is. It's a reminder of how deeply we're loved and cared for by him.
Okay, so we've covered how God knows by his essence, how he knows everything in a single act of intuition, and how he knows independently. Is there anything else about the nature of God's knowledge that Charnock explores in this section?
Oh, definitely. We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack. For example, Charnock also delves into how God knows all things distinctly, meaning he sees everything with perfect clarity and detail. Nothing is too small or too hidden for him.
That's fascinating. So not only does God know everything, but he knows everything in high definition, so to speak.
Exactly. He doesn't miss a single detail. He sees the big picture, and the tiniest brushstrokes all at the same time. And Charnock uses another great analogy to illustrate this. He compares it to looking through a microscope and seeing the intricate details of a tiny insect that would otherwise be invisible to the naked eye.
That's so cool. It's like God has this incredible zoom lens that can focus on everything at once.
It is.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's pause here for now. We'll be back in just a moment to continue this fascinating conversation about God's knowledge. Stay tuned.
You know, as we're discussing this, I can't help but think about how often we try to hide things from God,
Yeah,
as if we could somehow pull the wool over his eyes.
it's true. We can be so silly sometimes, can't we? It's like trying to hide a pebble in a sandbox.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of God's distinct knowledge is so important. It reminds us that nothing is hidden from him.
Right.
He sees everything with perfect clarity.
Yeah.
Not just our actions, but our thoughts, our motives, even the things we try to bury deep down inside.
So there's no fooling God. He sees right through all our facades.
Absolutely. And this leads to another characteristic of God's knowledge that Charnock highlights: infallibility. It means that God's knowledge is never wrong. It's as certain as his very being. He doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't have second guesses.
That makes sense. If God knows everything perfectly and completely, there's no room for error.
Precisely. And you know, this idea of infallibility has huge implications for our understanding of God's promises. Because if God's knowledge is infallible, his promises are also infallible.
That's a powerful thought. It means we can really trust God's word.
Yeah.
We can have confidence that what he says he will do, he will do.
Exactly. His promises are not based on guesswork or wishful thinking. They're rooted in his perfect and unchanging knowledge.
That's really encouraging, especially when we're going through tough times and we need to cling to God's promises.
Absolutely. And it's not just about promises. This infallibility also applies to God's judgments.
Okay, now that's a bit more sobering.
It is. But it's important to remember that God's judgments are always rooted in truth and righteousness. He sees everything clearly, and he judges fairly.
So we can't argue with God's assessment of things.
Well, we can try, but it's kind of like arguing with a math equation. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, whether we like it or not.
That's a good point. We can't change the truth no matter how much we might want to.
Right. And that's why it's so important to align ourselves with God's truth, to seek his wisdom and guidance, because ultimately his perspective is the only one that matters.
I'm also curious about this idea that God's knowledge is immutable.
Right.
We humans, we're constantly learning new things. Our understanding is always evolving. But God's knowledge is different, right? It's unchanging.
Exactly. That's what immutability means, unchanging. Think about it. God's knowledge is complete and perfect from all eternity. There's nothing he needs to learn, nothing he needs to add to his understanding.
So while we're down here struggling to figure things out, God is up there with the complete picture,
Yeah.
the full encyclopedia of knowledge.
It's more like he is the encyclopedia.
Okay.
His very being is knowledge. And because God is unchanging, so is his knowledge.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
All these different attributes of God's knowledge seem to reinforce each other, don't they?
They do. They all point back to the central truth that God's knowledge is perfect, complete, and absolute. There's no shadow of turning with him.
Okay, so we've talked about God's distinct knowledge,
Yeah.
his infallible knowledge, his immutable knowledge. Is there anything else Charnock throws into this mix?
There is. And this one is super interesting. He says that God knows perpetually in act.
Okay, break that down for me. What does perpetually in act mean when we're talking about knowledge?
Well, it means that God's knowledge isn't passive.
Okay.
He's not just storing information somewhere in the back of his mind. He's actively and constantly knowing all things. It's like his knowledge is always on, always in motion.
So God's not just aware of everything.
Right.
He's actively engaged with everything.
Exactly. And Charnock uses a vivid image to describe this. He says God's knowledge is like an unsleepy eye that never rests.
Wow.
He's always watching, always observing, always interacting with his creation.
That's a pretty powerful image. It reminds me of Psalm 139, where David talks about how God knows everything about us, even our thoughts, before we think them.
It's a beautiful passage that really captures this sense of God's constant presence and awareness.
You know, as we're talking about all these different aspects of God's knowledge, it makes me wonder how this should affect the way we live our lives.
That's a great question, because it's not just about having a theoretical understanding of God's knowledge. It's about letting that knowledge transform us.
Okay, so how does knowing that God knows everything change the way we approach life?
Well, for one thing, it should lead us to a greater sense of humility. We can be so quick to think we know it all, can't we?
Oh, yeah.
But when we consider the vastness of God's knowledge, it should put us in our place.
Right. It's like realizing that we're just tiny specks in this vast universe,
Yeah.
and God sees and knows everything, even the things we think are hidden.
And that realization should lead us to a deeper level of trust in him. Because if God knows everything, then we can trust that he's in control even when our lives feel chaotic and uncertain.
It's like surrendering the driver's seat to someone who knows the road perfectly.
Exactly. And that's where true peace and security come from, knowing that we're in the hands of a God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's pause here for now. We'll be back in just a moment to continue exploring how this understanding of God's knowledge should shape our lives. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics, where we explore timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today.
Yes,
We are deep in our dive
we are.
into Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. This book has been around for centuries.
It has.
But it's amazing how relevant it still is to our lives today.
It really is.
We're unpacking Chapter 8, Knowledge of God.
Yes.
And in this third part, I'm really curious to dig into how this whole concept of God's infinite knowledge should impact the way we live.
Yes, that's the key question, isn't it? It's easy to get lost in the theological weeds, but ultimately, what does this all mean for you, the listener? How should knowing that God knows everything change the way we approach our daily lives?
Right, because it's one thing to say, okay, God knows everything, but it's another thing to actually live as if that's true.
Exactly. And I think one of the most immediate implications is a heightened sense of accountability.
Okay.
Think about it. If you knew someone was watching your every move, listening to your every word, wouldn't it change the way you behaved?
It definitely would.
Yeah.
I'd probably be a lot more careful about what I said and did.
Well, that's the thing. We have an invisible witness to everything we do, think, and say.
Mm.
God sees it all, and not just the outward actions, but the inner motives and intentions as well.
So it's not just about putting on a good show for the outside world.
Not at all. God isn't fooled by our facades. He sees right through to the heart of who we are. And knowing that should make us more cautious about sin, more diligent in pursuing holiness, and more intentional about aligning our lives with God's will.
Because if we truly believe that God knows everything, then we can't really get away with anything, can we?
We can try, but ultimately we're only fooling ourselves. And this awareness of God's all-seeing eye shouldn't be a source of fear or dread. Instead, it should be a source of comfort and security.
Okay, explain that one to me. How can the thought of God knowing everything I do, even the things I'm not proud of, be comforting?
Because it means we're never truly alone. It means that God is with us in every moment, aware of our struggles, our fears, our doubts, and our joys. It means he understands us completely, even the parts of ourselves we try to hide.
That's a really beautiful way to think about it. It's like having a constant companion who knows us better than we know ourselves.
And not just any companion, but a companion who loves us unconditionally, who forgives us when we mess up, and who is always working for our good.
That brings me to another thought. If God knows everything, doesn't that also mean he knows how our story ends? I mean, does he already know what choices we're going to make, what path we're going to take?
That's a deep question, and it's one that has challenged theologians for centuries. But I think it's important to remember that God's knowledge doesn't negate our free will. He sees all the possibilities, all the choices we could make, but he allows us to make those choices freely.
So it's like we're writing our own story, but God is the ultimate editor, guiding us toward the best possible ending.
That's a great way to put it. And because God's knowledge is perfect, we can trust that he's guiding us toward what's best for us even when we don't understand his plan.
That's a huge comfort, especially when life feels uncertain and we're facing difficult decisions. It's like knowing that no matter what choices we make, God is there to catch us if we fall and to nudge us back on track if we stray too far.
And, this understanding of God's knowledge also has implications for how we view our circumstances. We can sometimes get so caught up in our problems and our struggles that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
It's like we're staring at a single puzzle piece, trying to make sense of it without seeing how it fits into the whole puzzle.
Exactly. But God sees the whole puzzle. He sees how all the pieces fit together, even the pieces that seem broken or out of place. And knowing that should give us hope even in the midst of trials and uncertainties.
It's like knowing that the master artist is at work, even when we can't see the finished masterpiece.
Right. We can trust that God is using every experience, every challenge, every victory to shape us into the people He created us to be.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm seeing God in a whole new light.
I'm glad to hear that. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Charnock's insights on God's knowledge, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder. If God truly knows everything, even the number of hairs on your head, then what does that say about His love for you, His care for you, and His purpose for your life?
That's a powerful question, and one that I hope will stay with our listeners long after this episode ends. And to our listeners, if you've enjoyed this deep dive into Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics so you don't miss future episodes in this series. Until next time, keep exploring the timeless truth of God's Word and discovering the wonders of His character.